Hi folks, and welcome to this most auspicious occasion, this most historic day, because this is the first Dragon's Teeth transmission from the shed. Yes, phase one is complete. We managed to clear a load of stuff out and create some space. Still a lot of work to do, of course. Going to put in some flooring, insulate the roof, give the place a bit of a paint, and then set up my painting area and desk and everything else, which of course we'll be filming over the next few weeks. But anyway, to business. Today I wanted to talk about one of my favourite books, one that I come back to again and again, because it's a sort of the book you can dip into as and when you like. And by chance, one of those examples of synchronicity, Steve at Bedford Gladiators on a Monday night was just talking to me about this chap a few weeks ago. That chap is Eric Brown, and the book is called Duels in the Sky. I think as gamers, in fact pretty much every gamer I know, and even people who are into sports and other stuff, are very interested in what if scenarios. Of course we can say we've got like fantasy games and RPGs and sci-fi, which you might consider totally what if. But most of the time, even with historical battles, unless it's a reenactment of Agincourt or a specific sort of action, most of the time we're doing what ifs or a representation of something from a particular campaign. Then, of course, for example, we might have specific historical what ifs. You could have a scenario where German Fallschirmjäger land on the south coast as part of Operation Sea Lion, for example, and are countered by the Home Guard. If we stick with World War II theme, you could say, what if the war didn't end in 1945, but we went into 1946? You can get all the big stuff out, right? Your Pershings and your E100s, maybe even a mouse. So it's very simple to set up these what ifs in historical contexts. But you can even go wider than that. You can say, what if we had a battle between a Zulu army and a samurai army, for example? So I think really that's one of the creative aspects of wargaming, that type of what if. Now, what Eric Brown has done in this book, Duels in the Sky, has applied that what if to World War II naval aircraft in combat. So the basic outline of the book is he goes through and looks at all the major naval air fighter planes and bomber planes of the Second World War, discusses their strengths and weaknesses, and then says, what if they were matched up against each other? What if we had a Spitfire 9 against a Zero, for example? Now that's all well and good. We might say, oh, that sounds interesting, but you know, every Tom, Dick or Sheila could come up with what if we flew this against this, that kind of thing, and speculate. Well, the big difference with Eric Brown, with Captain Eric Brown, is all the planes he talks about in this book, and there are dozens of them, he flew each and every one. I'll just repeat that. Captain Brown flew each and every plane he talks about, from a Hurricane in 1940 through to an Me-262 in 45 and beyond. So that gives him some authority, I feel, to discuss which plane he thinks will come out on top in these various dueling situations. But who is this man? Well, Eric Brown, later he was nicknamed Winkle because of his diminutive stature, which he did say saved him on occasion because he was able to curl up very tight in the cockpit. He was born in Hackney in 1920, so he's an East End boy. He's already got that going for him. He was adopted by a Scottish family and moved up to Scotland, and his adopted father was a former balloon observer and a pilot in the RFC in World War I. So as you might imagine, there was a keen interest in flying from very early on. And in fact, he first went up in a plane at the age of 8. His father took him up in a Gloucester Gauntlet. You can't imagine that sort of thing happening these days, can you? In 1936, his father took him to the Berlin Olympics, and there his father was invited to meet members of the newly formed Luftwaffe. The young Eric met Ernest Udet, who was a World War I German ace, And Udet also took him up into a two-seat plane, and there's a very lively account of this that Brown later wrote in his autobiography, which describes the hair-raising acrobatics that Udet put him through. Nonetheless, that didn't put the young Brown off, and in 1938, under Foreign Office sponsorship, Brown returned to Germany to attend a large automobile exhibition which was organised by Udet. Brown returned to Germany again in 1939 as an exchange student, and on the outbreak of war he was arrested by the SS and escorted to the Swiss border. On return to the UK, Brown immediately signed up for the RAF Volunteer Reserves and eventually ended up in the Fleet Air Arm. His first posting was to the escort carrier HMS Audacity, and this was the start of a really lengthy war service. He became a test pilot flying captured enemy aircraft, and he also became instrumental in a program of improving and refining deck landings onto aircraft carriers. And part of that work included landing a Sea Mosquito onto an aircraft carrier, which was believed the first example of a twin-engine plane landing on an aircraft carrier deck. As the war progressed, he also worked with the US AAF, the 8th Air Force, and he also got into being a test pilot for early jets. In fact, he worked very closely alongside Frank Whittle. At the end of the war, he was sent in Germany to secure German aeronautical technology, basically to get it before the Soviets could. That resulted in 12 AR-234 jets being flown back to the UK. And in that immediate post-war period, he continued to test fly German and Italian planes. And then, of course, as things progressed, he got into test flying more jets, including the de Havilland DH-108, which, as you might imagine at the time, was an incredibly risky undertaking. During the Korean War, he was an exchange officer with the Americans, and he attained the rank of Commander in the Royal Navy. He retired from the Royal Navy in 1970. His last flight was in 1994, but he continued lecturing up until 2015. If you want to find more about this quite incredible man, he did write an autobiography, Wings on My Sleeve, and in 2014 the BBC did, I think it's a 2-hour documentary on him called Britain's Greatest Pilot. That's a title that's hard for anyone to dispute, because Captain Brown still holds the Guinness Book of Records record for flying the most number of different types of planes, 487 different types. He also holds the record still for the number of deck landings, 2,407. Quite an amazing figure, I'm sure you agree. So an incredible life, an incredible service history. Let's get into the book and see what he has to say about these different aircraft. So, Duels in the Sky, World War II Naval Aircraft in Combat by Captain Eric M. Brown, RN. Very nicely produced book. And the jacket painting, that's an F-4U Corsair and Focke-Wulf 109 in theoretical combat by Morgan Wilbur. It's published by Airlife Publishing, and this edition is 1989, originally published in 1988 by the United States Naval Institute. So we get an introduction by the author. There's a picture of him there in 1969. And here he just talks about what the book is about how one thing with World War II equipment, of course, is we have a wealth of knowledge and information on it. And it starts with the state of play pre-war. And here he's talking about how the German military re-established themselves, the formation of the Luftwaffe, etc., etc. And of course, this is something he had some direct experience of. Here we've got a picture of senior Luftwaffe officers at Rechlin Aircraft Test Establishment in 1939. And it describes here his visits to Berlin that we mentioned earlier, the Olympic Games and everything else. He then goes on to talk about naval aviation because, I guess as I said before, this was something in its infancy. But anyway, there's some history here about how the different nations developed their naval aviation, and then we get on to the planes themselves. So the basic outline is going through the war year by year, looking at the major campaigns involved, a brief history of the major naval aviation campaigns, and then looking at the specific planes involved. And we start with the Gloucester Sea Gladiator. And I just like this. I have flown all these and they make interesting comparison. We get something of a history of the design of the plane, how it came to be developed, and then we get this this sort of first-hand report of how they flew and how they landed and their manoeuvrability and so on. So for the Gloucester Sea Gladiator, we get takeoff was short and the climb to 10,000 feet took 4.75 minutes. At that altitude, maximum speed was 250 miles per hour and manoeuvrability was outstanding with beautiful harmony of control. Of course, he describes the armament of each plane, the fuel it carries, and then gives an overall assessment. So the assessment for the Gladiator, which I guess is the earliest type of plane covered here. The Gladiator, in service with 14 air forces in the world, was undoubtedly one of the greatest biplane fighters ever built, but appearing almost simultaneously with the first of the new breed of heavily armed monoplane fighters and bombers, it was pitched into a combat era where it was outgunned and outperformed, though never outmaneuvered. So, these are our early planes. We've got the Skua, we've got the Fairy Swordfish. Then we get into some of the German planes, the Me-109E, of course. A lot of information on the 109. And then we're into the Messerschmitt 110. And, of course, the Junkers 87B, the Stuka. So we get an outline of 1939 operations, the opening months of World War II. And here we start to get the first of our plane-to-plane combats with the Sea Gladiator versus the Messerschmitt 109E, where he basically says the biplane's only hope of survival rested in its remarkable manoeuvrability. Now, they're not actually in the war yet, but 1939 we do get a look at the United States, the Soviet Union, and also the Japanese capabilities as well, and their initial planes. And there's even mention here of when Japan's Kwantung Army seized Manchuria in the winter of 1931, Japan used aircraft carriers with great success. It suffered setbacks in 1937 when its biplane fighters encountered Russian Ratas flown by Chinese pilots that had been trained by former US Army Air Corps officers. So we think about World War II for scenarios and, you know, World War I, but there's all these other little events and things and campaigns going on around that that would make for good gaming, I'm sure. 1940, the year of isolation, from the British point of view, of course, where England became something of a feeling of under siege, I guess. We were off of the continent, things weren't going so well. So here we get the Italians coming into the war. That naturally brings us into our Mediterranean theatre and the Italian planes such as the Fiat CR-42, the Savoia Marchetti 79 and so on. Malta, of course, was a major battle in the Mediterranean, both from a naval and aviation perspective. So as I said, that's the basic structure of the book. It takes us through year by year, the sinking of the Ark Royal in 1941. Again, mostly from the British point of view, things are happening in the Mediterranean theatre, with some action also in the North Atlantic. This is where we get into our Sea Hurricanes, the Wildcat, and also, I think maybe one of the largest planes of the Second World War, the Focke-Wulf 200 Courier, the Condor. That was used a lot in anti-shipping operations. And there's another one of these little anecdotes. The only Condor I flew was the FW 200C4/U1, which had been the personal transport of the notorious SS leader Heinrich Himmler and later of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. So yes, the Condor, very large plane. The verdict on that: thoroughly effective long-range maritime reconnaissance bomber, but with the inherent shortcomings that were to be expected of a converted commercial airliner. Basically, it's got a lack of armour, but to counter that, It's got a lot of guns. It's bristling with guns, that one. And then we get our matchups again. Sea Hurricane 1 versus the ME-110, etc, etc. We next get the entrance of Japan into the war and the start of the Pacific Theatre, which of course was primarily naval aviation, right? I know there were landings on the islands and everything else, but when we think of the Pacific War, we tend to think of the battles like Midway and so on, those huge carrier and fleet battles where the aircraft really came into its own. And I guess with the Pacific Theatre, the naval battles in particular, we tend to think of dive bombers and torpedo bombers. So this chapter we also start to get into things like the Douglas Dauntless, the Kate torpedo bomber, the Devastator and so on. Plus, of course, how they will fare against the fighter cover. So Devastator versus Zeke, etc. Then we're into probably the big set piece battle of the time, the Battle of Midway. We even get a look at the Catalina, which I guess was used in a reconnaissance role. Maybe anti-sub. I think it was used as anti-submarine in the Atlantic. I'm not sure about the Pacific. 1943 sees us back in the Atlantic, but then also continuing on with the Pacific campaign. And a lot of new aircraft coming in there. I guess aircraft development and production really accelerated at this time. And we start to see the appearance of things like the Focke-Wulf 190, or the later models of that. And the upgrades, of course, to things like the Wildcat and the Spitfire and so on, or the Seafire, as the naval version was known. 1944, Allies return to the Indian Ocean, and we also get a nice piece on neutralising the Tirpitz, which at the time was operating in Norwegian waters and had been a constant threat to the Arctic convoys travelling from Britain to Russia. After being heavily damaged by a midget submarine attack in September 43 in Altenfjord, she was moved for repairs to Karfjord on the northern tip of Norway, where the steep sides of the fjord would protect her from torpedo attack by air. So what they did instead was send in dive bombing barracudas. So again, a nice little potted history of that event. I'm sure that will make a great game as well. And of course the major operation in 1944 is Overlord, combined sea, air and land forces. Huge undertaking. 16 Fleet Air Arm squadrons were involved, 6 Avenger squadrons, 3 squadrons of Swordfish 3s, Hellcat squadron, 2 squadrons of Seafire 3s, 2 squadrons of Seafire 2s and Spitfire L5Bs, all flown by naval pilots specially trained in bombardment spotting and army cooperation. And then we're into 1945. I don't think there was a lot of action in Europe at this time as far as naval aviation goes, but of course in the Far East we've got those island hopping campaigns going on. We've got the first attack on Formosa, we've got the British active in the Indian Ocean, and we're building up to the final attack on the Japanese homeland. And by this stage of the war we're getting those real high-end fighter planes. I guess they're reaching the peak of their development before the jets come in. So up to now we've had these duels that actually happened, right? We've been looking at fighters in specific theatres, and he's assessing how they would fare against each other. But chapter 8 we get into theoretical combat, so now we get into our what ifs. And this is where he starts listing what he thinks are the top fighters, the top dive bombers, the top torpedo bombers and so on, and matches them up against each other. Now of course at this time we also get the first appearance of the jets, in particular the ME-262, which he very bravely, I think, test flew as well. View from the cockpit was excellent and the instruments were logically laid out. Starting was a complex procedure, I can imagine it was, and during taxiing the throttles had to be moved with restraint so as not to exceed the jet pipe temperature limits. Harmony of control was pleasant, with a stick force per G of 6 pounds at mid-centre of gravity and a rate of roll of 360 degrees in 3.8 seconds at 400 miles an hour. Its stability promised an accurate gun platform. So then he starts matching all these top aircraft up, the Hellcat 2 versus the ME-262, the Mustang 4 versus the George 12, Spitfire 14 versus the Zeke 53, and so on and so on. Even things like the Mustang 4 versus the Spitfire 14. So even planes on the same side, he matches up, again from that perspective of having flown them. And here's a great example of one of those casual little reminiscences that he throws in. So we're talking Mustang 4 versus Spitfire 14. The exploitation of these relative assets brought offensive and defensive advantages, and I can see no sure way to victory for either combatant. So they're very evenly matched. I've flown both for many hours and would probably choose the Spitfire if given the choice in a fight to the death. And then he casually adds, I once flew a Spitfire 9 against a Focke-Wulf 190 over France, when after only 10 minutes of thrust and parry in a G-loaded dogfight, we both broke off the battle simultaneously, as if in mutual recognition of an indecisive outcome. Marvellous. So that's what rounds the book off, these final assessments. What's the greatest naval fighter of World War II, and his criteria for assessing that. I'm not going to tell you what he chooses as the best, because you can read the book yourself. But not only the fighters, but it was the most effective dive bomber, the most effective torpedo bomber, and so on. So fascinating stuff, again, all from a first-hand perspective. And it rounds out very nicely with talk of the McDonnell F4K Phantom. And here's another one of those nice little reminiscences. I made my first deck landing in a Wildcat and my last in a Phantom, and consider myself privileged to have rounded off a naval flying career with such an Alpha and Omega. Isn't that marvellous? You start with a Wildcat and you end with a Phantom. And the final conclusion is perhaps the most telling of all, because you might think with this kind of book there's a certain amount of glamorization goes on, Knights of the Air and all that kind of thing. But this is a man who fought, who saw combat, and has a very particular view on it. It has been said that the glamour has gone out of aerial combat, but truth to tell, there was never any glamour in it. Fear, pain, almost unbearable physical and mental stress, these do not add up to glamour, and to pretend they do is to glorify war. Since those days, airplane design and performance, weapons and equipment have changed drastically, but the pilot has not. It is the pilot, not the technology, that ultimately decides which aircraft will win a duel in the sky. So there we go. As I said at the start, this is one of my favourite books, and one of those that I dip into over and over again. I think it's fascinating to see that level of expertise applied to that what-if situation and scenario. And if you want to find out more about Captain Brown and his amazing life, as I said, there is an autobiography, Wings on My Sleeve, and there was that BBC documentary as well. I'm going to see if I can find that on YouTube or on the net somewhere. If I can, I'll put a link to it in the notes below. And do let me know if you've got this book. Do you agree with the captain's assessment? It'd be hard not to, really, wouldn't it? Or even if you hadn't read it, do let me know what you think the best fighter plane of World War II was, the best dive bomber, the best torpedo bomber, and so on and so on. It'd be interesting to see what people come up with. I would imagine everyone's going to be pretty much hovering around the same few planes. But, you know, there might be some wild card out there that no one's thought of. Thanks again for watching and joining me in my inaugural Shed broadcast. Many more to come. As always, if you're enjoying the channel, please do like, share and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.